Okay, so my name is Gordon McNichol. I'm a professor at Purdue University in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology, but I also have appointments in the Center for Plant Biology and in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology group in the biology department. And so this lecture is going to be a really quick and brief introduction to evolutionary game theory. If you're interested in it, maybe this can get you on the path to reading some interesting articles and learning a bit more. At its core, my research program is about trying to understand patterns of species diversity, either at the global scale or at the local scale. So if you take a look at this picture, it's a grassland in Chicago. We can see that there's different patterns of species in the background, in this low-lying area, and up on the hilltop, right? So there's different species in those different places. I would love to understand why, but more than that, why is this purple coneflower here and not back here somewhere, right? And so these are questions ecologists don't have good answers to. And to do that, I like to combine ecology and evolution using evolutionary game theory. And so there's an old book by G. Evelyn Hutchinson, one of the fathers of modern ecology, that he titled The Ecological Theater and the Evolutionary Play. And I really like this metaphor. So let's think through how these things interact with each other, right? So ecology is a definition we could give is it's the study of outcomes of interactions among individuals and the environment, right? In ecology, you have individuals who are interacting all the time. They might be of the same species, they might be different species, they might be predators or prey or competitors or mutualists, right? There's many kinds of interactions. But these individuals are also constrained by environmental conditions, things like resources and temperature and whatever else is limiting species about the environment. So that's the theater, right? We've got this theater of interactions. And inside that theater, we've got a play, which is evolution by natural selection, right? And evolution by natural selection requires three things. You need heritable variation, a struggle for existence, and that the variation influences the struggle, right? The struggle for existence, that's ecology. And then evolution can take place as long as you have heritable variation, and that variation influences your ability to survive and reproduce. And these things clearly feed back on each other, right? The interactions are going to shape the struggle, or are the struggle. And then who makes it through that struggle are going to shape the future interactions, right? So this is constantly feeding back. The theater and the play are feeding back on each other. Now, of course, evolution doesn't only occur by natural selection. There are other important mechanisms of evolution. That can be gene flow, or sometimes called migration. There can be genetic drift, and there can be mutation, right? And so mutation is what generates the heritable variation. Genetic drift can limit it, and gene flow can potentially change it. And what I've sort of done here is I've color-coded in red and blue basically what are the genetic mechanisms and what are the ecological mechanisms, right? You can have gene flow either for ecological reasons due to migration, or for random reasons, which is gene flow, right? So in total, evolution is all of these different mechanisms that can occur. But the red ones are the ones that are ecological. Right, and so if we go back to ecology, the outcomes of interactions depend on the traits of organisms, and the struggle for existence that creates the traits depends on the outcomes of interactions, right? So we get this feedback that's really useful. And I think that game theory is one of the key ways that we can connect these two ideas and understand them. So what is game theory? Let's take a step back out of biology for a second, right? So if you imagine, what is the essential feature of a game, like basketball or Monopoly or checkers, right? Well, the essential features are, I would argue, players, strategies, and payoffs, right? So let's imagine a game of checkers. We have two players. The strategies involve a set of rules, like you can only hop diagonally, that you can hop multiple pieces if they're in a certain pattern, and that you take turns, right? And the payoff is perhaps bragging rights, or who knows what's happening in this strange picture, right? And then the key is that my payoff, if I was playing one of you in a game of checkers, is going to depend on what I do, the different moves I make, but it's also going to depend on what you do, right? And obviously vice versa. And so the key to game theory is that if you came into a game of checkers as a scientist and you didn't know the rules, and you decided you were only going to pay attention to this person playing the game, I don't think you'd be able to figure out what she was doing. It would look like she was just moving randomly. As soon as you pay attention to the red and the black pieces, it starts to become crystal clear what her strategy is and what she's attempting to do. Right? So mathematical games have unique properties and they have unique solutions. And what we've seen over the years is that it's actually really easy to get the wrong answer. Right? John Nash won a Nobel Prize because he finally figured out how to solve some of these problems in ways that people hadn't figured out before. And he showed that people were getting the wrong answers. And just in case you think this is a completely trivial example, checkers, you can actually publish a paper in Science magazine by doing the mathematics of checkers. Okay, so that's sort of classical game theory. But what is evolutionary game theory, right? There's obviously differences between a game of checkers and biology. Well, the idea is it sort of depends on an argument from analogy. The suggestion then is that interactions in nature take on the essential features of a game. Those features are strategies, players, payoffs, right? And so the strategies are the different traits that organisms have, right? So here's an example of different organisms that attack plant leaves, right? And some of them have different traits. Some of them chew leaves, some of them suck phloem, some of them mine through the palisade cells. Some of them are pathogens, and all of these have different traits. And the plants might have traits, different defense mechanisms, right? And so those are their strategies, the traits. The payoff is whether or not they get to survive and reproduce. And the strategies, and the players are the different individuals in the environment. So if we just take a look at plants, right, here are all the different kinds of enemies that plants can have that attack seeds, they attack flowers, they attack leaves, they attack pollen, they attack roots. There's all kinds of pathogens that have all kinds of different strategies. And then these are the different kinds of sort of symbionts and cooperation that plants can have, right? Between pollination, seed dispersers, mycorrhizal fungi. And this picture doesn't even show plant-plant competition, which has been a major selective force in the basic structure of plants. It's probably why plants have stems in the first place. So that's evolutionary game theory. So let's just take some quick definitions. I've already hinted at these, right? So I'm going to define strategy in evolutionary game theory as adaptations, the noun, not the verb. Adaptations that influence the interactions of organisms with each other and the environment. We can say that adaptations are the traits of organisms shaped by natural selection, and we've already defined natural selection as something like the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in adaptations. I'm just going to put on here the definition of functional traits, because we have this word trait up here, right? Traits are adaptations. We can see that there's a parallel between strategy and adaptations. Traits are the adaptations that define a species based on their ecological roles, both in terms of how they interact with the environment and with other individuals and other species, right? So those are the strategies. The payoff in an evolutionary game is fitness, which is defined as survival and reproduction. Mathematically, this becomes equivalent to a per capita population growth rate. Per capita makes this at the individual level, not at the group level. And sometimes I think people find this surprising, but it's kind of obvious when you look at the mathematics of population growth, right? So if we make a really simple difference equation, if we know the current population size, and we know all the births and all the deaths, we can predict the population size of the next generation, right? And births and deaths are survival and reproduction. So if we know this at the per capita level, then we can define fitness as this per capita population growth rate. And then evolution by natural selection depends on the definition of the evolutionarily stable strategy, the ESS. So in my world, the way you can say PCR or DNA, and many people in biology will know what you mean, you can just say ESS and people know what you mean. The ESS is the strategy that, once adopted by the population, cannot be invaded by any players doing something different with different traits, and conversely can invade populations using alternative strategies. And it's important to recognize that a lot of people misunderstand that it doesn't have to be one strategy. It can be a coalition of multiple strategies, right? So that this could be a mechanism for getting variation within a population or even within a community. And so the key feature of ESS, just to put it in something simple, is that you need to be able to invade and resist invasion. And if that's true, then no matter where the world starts, you're going to go to whatever trait we say is the ESS. And remember, we've defined strategies in evolutionary game theory as traits. So those are the strategies, and that's the payoff. But what about the players? Well, evolutionary game theory has sort of unique properties when we compare it to a classical game like checkers. And this is all argued in much more detail in this paper that I co-authored with some of the people who sort of invented modern game theory. And so I want to go through six differences, right? So if we think of a classical game versus an evolutionary game, one of those differences is that there's usually a fixed number of players in a classical game, right? A basketball game has a certain number of players out on the court. Checkers game has 2 players. And you don't get more players by winning, right? It's not like if this guy wins the game of checkers, he gets to have 3 copies of himself playing in the next round. But that is how it works in evolutionary game theory, right? The number of players is constantly changing due to population dynamics as they're being born or dying in the struggle to survive and reproduce. You also, for the same reason, have a fixed number of strategies, a fixed frequency of strategies, right? So if we compare her strategy to his strategy, it's 50-50. That's the frequency. And again, it's not like if he wins, he gets to have more of his strategy on his side. But that is exactly how it works in evolutionary game theory. The individuals who survive and pass on their genes change the frequency of traits by population and dynamics and through evolutionary dynamics. A lot of people get stuck on this one when they're thinking about evolutionary game theory, particularly when we want to apply it to plants. But in classical games, players can choose their strategies, usually rationally, and they can switch strategies. So if whatever this guy's doing to win at checkers isn't working, he could try something different. Whereas in evolutionary game theory, players inherit their strategies and they usually can't switch. Now, of course, there is some plasticity and there is behavior. But what I mean is that like a plant can't evolve into an elephant if that would benefit. Whereas there's considerably more flexibility in the types of strategies that this guy uses from one day to the next and from one interaction to the next. The other difference is maybe kind of obvious, but the payoff can be anything of value in a classical game, you know, bragging rights, money, some kind of basketball trophy. But in evolutionary game theory, the payoff is always fitness. It's either you survive or you reproduce, or both. The other key thing is that the players are the focus in classical games. We're usually interested in which one of these two people is going to win, whereas in evolutionary game theory, if you really try to pay attention to every individual player, it can be too complicated, right? And so instead, we're usually interested in what traits are going to evolve, because the players are constantly coming and going in large population sizes. And then finally, you know, players can use forethought in a classical game, whereas evolution has no forethought. There's no planning here. So I think that 3 and 5 are the ones that tend to get people the most, that they imagine some kind of strange wizardry in my mind when I talk about evolutionary game theory, particularly as it applies to plants. But there's no forethought. It's just evolution by natural selection. And that game theory gives us the analogy with a classical game, that you have players, strategies, and payoffs, and that there's a unique solution when you have those 3 things, gives us some power that you don't have without evolutionary game theory. And there's a few flavors of game theory. I'm only going to talk about 2 in this brief introduction, but just to give you a sense of what's out there, right? So one of them is matrix games, which I'm going to talk about in the next segment. This is what you can use when traits are categorical, right? So a plant has red flowers or it has white flowers or something like this. And I'll give you some examples in the next video. Right, so it's mostly about trait optimization, but with that unique optimization criterion, the ESS. And if you don't use the ESS when you have a game, you actually often get the wrong answer. You can also have continuous games when the traits are continuous, and I think fewer people are familiar with these continuous games, right? So if you're thinking about how tall should a plant be, right, that's a continuous trait, and we need a different kind of game theory, and I'll show you why that is. Again, this is a trait optimization, but we tend to add population dynamics into the continuous games. So it's got ordinary differential equations hiding inside. And then the last form that I know has been used are what are called extensive form games. This is when the interactions are sequential and they kind of go on through time. So it's something turn-based like checkers and most board games. And so in nature, people have modeled foraging this way, right? So you have to make a series of sequential decisions about whether it's safe to eat or whether you should keep moving or where to go. You could think of these like individual-based models, although they don't have to be. And I'm not going to talk about these because I think they have relatively limited use in biology, even though they have been used before. So if this is the world you're trying to think about, then this isn't the video for you. So hopefully this short video gave you a sense of what evolutionary game theory is, and some basic definitions, and a bit of a roadmap of where I want to go in the next videos. And so there's going to be a video about matrix games and a separate video about continuous games that you can watch if you're still interested.